It all started with a seemingly innocent press conference, the kind that happens every week in Washington, D.C. Karoline Leavitt, the young, dynamic congresswoman from New Hampshire, was holding court, surrounded by the usual group of reporters. But there was something different about today. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Leavitt, known for her no-nonsense approach, had been on a roll lately, making headlines with her firm stance against liberal policies. Her supporters praised her boldness, while her critics mocked her as too brash, too unapologetic. But one thing was certain, she had the nerve to back up every word she said. As usual, the reporters from various news outlets were eager to get a piece of her. Among them was Jennifer Hayes, a reporter from a left-wing news outlet that had clashed with Leavitt multiple times before. Hayes, a seasoned journalist with a reputation for pushing boundaries, stood at the back of the room, waiting for her turn. Leavitt took the microphone, and the room quieted. "Congresswoman, what is your stance on the recent proposal to increase taxes on the wealthy?" A reporter asked, breaking the silence. Leavitt smirked, giving a confident response, slamming the idea as another form of government overreach. But as she finished speaking, Hayes' hand shot up. "Congresswoman Leavitt, why do you continue to support policies that disproportionately hurt the poor and working class?" Hayes asked, her voice calm but sharp, her eyes locking with Leavitt's. The room held its breath. Leavitt's eyes narrowed for a moment, a flicker of irritation passing over her face. She didn't answer right away, instead choosing to let the weight of her silence fill the space. "That's a question I've answered before, Jennifer. Perhaps you should take a look at my record," Leavitt responded curtly, her voice colder now. Hayes, however, was undeterred. She pushed again. "But how do you justify your support for tax cuts for billionaires while simultaneously cutting programs that help struggling families?" Leavitt's jaw tightened. The tension in the room became palpable. "That's a false narrative, and I'm not here to entertain it," she shot back, her voice firm and unwavering. She glanced over at her staff as if seeking a cue to wrap up the exchange, but Hayes wasn't done yet. "Congresswoman," Hayes persisted, "isn't this hypocrisy at its finest? You claim to represent the people, yet you consistently support the interests of the rich and powerful." Leavitt's eyes flashed with something darker now, a storm brewing behind her usual composed demeanor. She took a deep breath. This was getting out of hand, and she was tired of the same questions being thrown at her every week. Enough was enough. "Jennifer," she began, her voice cool and controlled, "you've asked that question 3 times now. I think you know my position, and I think you're deliberately misrepresenting it. So, let me make it very clear, I'm here to talk about solutions, not to engage in the same tired talking points." But Hayes wasn't finished. She smiled, almost too sweetly. "One last question, Congresswoman, if I may. Will you stop supporting these tax cuts for billionaires and focus on policies that actually benefit the middle class?" Leavitt's patience snapped. Without another word, she turned to her communications director, giving a subtle but unmistakable nod. The room gasped as security approached. The tension in the room was thick as security guards stepped forward, their presence immediately turning the atmosphere from tense to downright uncomfortable. The reporters, who had been whispering and murmuring in disbelief just moments before, fell silent. The only sound was the shuffle of footsteps as the guards made their way toward Jennifer Hayes, who was still standing, her microphone clutched tightly in her hand. Leavitt's gaze was cold as she addressed the room, her voice ringing out, crisp and clear. "I've had enough," she said, her eyes locked on Hayes. "You've had more than your fair share of time. You continue to push the same baseless narrative, and frankly, it's unprofessional. We're done here." There was a collective gasp as the realization hit, Leavitt wasn't just shutting down the line of questioning, she was removing a reporter from the press conference entirely. Hayes didn't flinch. She stood her ground, even as the security guards approached her. "Congresswoman, you can't just kick me out like this," Hayes said, her voice rising slightly, now laced with frustration. "I'm just doing my job." Leavitt's eyes narrowed, and she took a step toward Hayes, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "You're not doing your job," Leavitt shot back. "You're pushing a personal agenda. And you're doing it at the expense of your audience. Your job is to report, not to make statements and push political talking points. It's clear you're not here for answers, you're here to antagonize. So yes, I can kick you out, and I will." The security guards now stood right next to Hayes, their hands ready but not yet grabbing her. They were waiting for her to make the next move. The room was on edge. Some reporters looked nervously at each other, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. Others, like those from the right-wing outlets, seemed almost eager, waiting for Leavitt to take charge. It was clear this wasn't just a regular press conference anymore, this was turning into a spectacle. Hayes, however, was not easily intimidated. She shook her head, her lips curling into a small, almost defiant smile. "I didn't think you had it in you," she muttered under her breath, her voice just loud enough for those closest to hear. Leavitt, unflinching, turned to the security guards and nodded once. The message was clear. "Escort her out." As the guards moved in, Hayes shot Leavitt one last glare. Her eyes were filled with both anger and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite process what had just happened. "Just remember this moment," Hayes said as she was led toward the exit. "This will be your legacy, an elected official who silences free speech." Leavitt didn't respond. She turned her back on Hayes as the door to the conference room closed behind her, the sound of it echoing in the tense silence. "Anyone else have any questions?" Leavitt asked coolly, her voice now back to its usual, controlled tone. But the room was in shock. No one moved. The press conference ended abruptly, but the controversy had only just begun. Within minutes of Hayes being escorted out, social media erupted. News outlets, both liberal and conservative, began to spin the story in their own directions, but one thing was clear: Karoline Leavitt's move to remove a reporter from the room had become the defining moment of the day. Leavitt's press team quickly issued a statement defending her actions, framing them as necessary to maintain the integrity of the press conference. The statement claimed that Hayes had crossed a line by repeatedly asking the same partisan question and attempting to disrupt the event. It argued that Leavitt was there to provide answers and discuss policy, not to endure what they described as political theater. On the other side, Hayes took to Twitter to express her outrage. "Today, Karoline Leavitt showed us exactly who she is, a politician who can't handle tough questions. #silencing the press." The tweet went viral, sparking a wave of support from journalists and critics alike. Several prominent reporters chimed in, accusing Leavitt of undermining press freedom. "Is this how we handle uncomfortable questions now?" one journalist wrote. "What's next? Banning journalists who ask tough questions?" But Leavitt wasn't backing down. She appeared on conservative talk shows, where her supporters rallied behind her, praising her for standing firm. On these platforms, she framed the incident as a victory over the liberal media, a necessary action to protect the truth from biased reporting. "This wasn't about silencing anyone," Leavitt explained in one interview. "This was about maintaining respect for the process and the people's right to hear the truth, not biased spin." The pushback from the left grew more intense, but it didn't seem to faze Leavitt. Her approval ratings among conservative voters surged. Her bold stance had made her a hero among her base, solidifying her image as a fighter who wasn't afraid to take on the establishment, whether it was the media, the Democrats, or even her own party when necessary. But behind the scenes, things were beginning to unravel. Her communications team had been working overtime to control the narrative, but there were cracks in the facade. One key member of her team, a seasoned strategist who had been with her since her early campaigns, quietly resigned in the aftermath of the incident. Sources claimed that he had warned her against escalating the situation with Hayes, suggesting that it could backfire. In private meetings, Leavitt's political advisors debated the long-term ramifications of her decision. While it had earned her immediate praise from her supporters, it had alienated a large portion of the independent and moderate voters who viewed the incident as a sign of authoritarian behavior. Meanwhile, in the halls of Congress, whispers began to spread. Some members of her own party privately questioned whether her confrontational style was alienating potential allies. Could Leavitt maintain the balance between being a champion for the right-wing base and an effective legislator who could work across the aisle? For Leavitt, the decision to remove Hayes wasn't just about silencing a reporter. It was about setting a precedent, one where the rules of engagement were clearly defined, and there was no room for disrespect or disruption. In her mind, she had done what was necessary to protect her message and her dignity. But as the weeks wore on, it became clear that the fallout from that decision would follow her for much longer than she had anticipated. As the days passed, the media circus surrounding Karoline Leavitt's decision began to settle into a new, more polarized narrative. The incident at the press conference was no longer just a one-off moment, it had become a defining issue in Leavitt's political career. And now, as the dust slowly started to clear, the consequences of her actions were becoming harder to ignore. While her supporters continued to praise her for taking a stand against the press, the story took on a life of its own in the national media. Leavitt was now facing criticism from more than just the left-wing outlets. Even some conservative voices were beginning to question the implications of her actions. A prominent conservative pundit, one who had initially backed her, made waves with a sharp rebuke. "I supported Karoline for her courage and her refusal to back down in the face of liberal media attacks," he said in a televised interview. "But this goes too far. We cannot start down the road of silencing reporters just because we don't like the questions they ask. That's the playbook of dictators, not Democrats." His comments sent a ripple of uncertainty through Leavitt supporters, especially those in her own party who were already uneasy about her combative style. While the right-wing base still cheered her on, questioning whether the backlash was simply part of a left-wing plot to discredit her, there were growing murmurs among Republicans who believed that her actions were tarnishing their party's image. Behind closed doors, senior members of Leavitt's staff began to show signs of frustration. There was talk of an upcoming re-election campaign, and some advisors were already worried about how her latest controversy might affect her chances. Would voters remember the bold, brash leader who was unafraid to stand up to the press, or would they focus on the incident as an example of a politician who was too quick to dismiss dissenting voices? Leavitt herself seemed unfazed by the criticism. At least, that was the impression she gave to the public. Privately, however, the weight of the situation was beginning to take its toll. She had built her entire career on being unapologetically herself, but this was different. The fallout had reached a level that even her fiercest defenders couldn't ignore. In one rare moment of vulnerability, Leavitt called a private meeting with her closest advisors. As the discussion unfolded, the air in the room felt heavy. No one wanted to be the one to deliver bad news, but it was clear that the risks of her approach were now more evident than ever. "I'm not going to apologize for what I did," Leavitt stated firmly. "I stood up for myself, for my message, and for my constituents. I'm not going to let some reporter think she can control the narrative. But if they want to turn this into something bigger, fine. Let them. I'll fight through it like I always do." Her team, still divided on the matter, nodded in agreement, though their faces betrayed the anxiety simmering beneath the surface. Some suggested that Leavitt should pivot, soften her tone slightly, and engage in more public outreach to repair the image she had damaged. Others argued that she should double down on her combative style, refusing to back down and letting her base see her as a fearless leader in the face of adversity. The next few weeks were marked by a series of strategic decisions, each designed to either weather the storm or add fuel to the fire. Leavitt appeared on several national news programs, defending her actions but also acknowledging that the controversy had created divisions. However, rather than attempt to heal the rift, she seemed to embrace the divide, framing it as a battle between truth and lies, between the people and the elites. But for every rallying speech that garnered cheers, there was an equal number of independent voters who grew more skeptical of her motives. For some, her unapologetic approach was refreshing, a sharp contrast to the typical political rhetoric they were used to. For others, it felt like a signal of a politician who was more concerned with winning at any cost than with listening to the concerns of those who didn't agree with her. Meanwhile, Jennifer Hayes, the reporter who had been removed from the press conference, became something of a martyr for the cause of journalistic freedom. She continued to cover the story, highlighting the dangers of government officials who sought to silence the press. Despite the backlash from Leavitt supporters, Hayes' reporting drew attention to the growing issue of press freedom in the modern political climate. The battle was no longer just between Leavitt and Hayes, it was about a larger question: how far could politicians go in controlling the narrative, and at what point did it cross a line into authoritarianism? As the months wore on, the incident that had once felt like a single, heated moment continued to echo through Leavitt's political career. The initial shockwave had settled, but the aftershocks kept coming. The media had moved on to other stories, but the questions surrounding her actions remained. Polling data began to show a marked divide. Her approval among conservatives remained strong, but her support among independents and moderates was slipping. In Washington, Leavitt had always been a firebrand, unafraid to ruffle feathers. But the press conference incident had made her the center of an entirely different conversation. No longer just a conservative favorite, she had become a lightning rod for larger debates about the role of the press in a democracy and the limits of power. Some viewed her as a crusader, others as a cautionary tale. Behind closed doors, the pressure was mounting. Her advisers, who had initially stood by her decision, were now urging her to consider the long-term political cost. "You can't just keep fighting battles this way," one senior staffer told her during a strategy meeting. "You've made your point. Now you need to show you can lead, not just fight." Leavitt listened, her expression unreadable. She had always prided herself on being a fighter, a truth-teller, and a defender of her values. She wasn't the type to bend to political pressure. But the situation was different now. She was at a crossroads, and the path forward wasn't clear. Then, just as things seemed to hit an impasse, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. A major piece of legislation was about to come up for a vote in Congress, a bill that would overhaul healthcare policy and address rising prescription drug prices. It was an issue that had deeply divided the country, and Leavitt knew that her position could either make or break her reputation in the broader political landscape. For weeks, the GOP had been split on how to handle the bill. Some saw it as a necessary reform, others felt it was just another step in the Democrats' push toward socialism. Leavitt, ever the pragmatist, saw it as a chance to shift the narrative. If she could use this bill to show that she was willing to work across the aisle when it mattered, she could regain some of the independence she had lost. If she could come out as a moderate, a leader who could put the country above party politics, maybe she could begin to rebuild the trust she had lost in the eyes of the American people. But that would require a delicate balance. She would have to push for the reforms she believed in, while also compromising enough to work with the Democrats and independent moderates. It wasn't something she was used to doing, and it would certainly not come without backlash from her staunchest supporters. Yet, it was the best chance she had to navigate out of the political minefield she had found herself in. She made her decision. She would stand with the moderates, vote in favor of the bill, and work with Democrats to ensure that the reform would include measures to lower prescription drug costs for the average American. It would be a bold move, a gamble. But she believed in the cause, and she needed to show the American people that she could govern, not just fight. Her decision was met with immediate pushback from her conservative base. The reactions were swift and harsh. Leavitt was accused of betraying her principles, of aligning herself with the very policies she had spent her career opposing. The conservative pundits who had once defended her now turned against her, calling her a traitor to the cause. But Leavitt wasn't swayed. As the votes for the bill approached, she doubled down on her stance. She appeared on several talk shows, explaining her decision to vote in favor of the bill, framing it as a necessary step toward improving the lives of millions of Americans who were struggling with healthcare costs. "I know some of you don't agree with me," she said in one interview. "But we cannot continue to ignore the suffering of our people. This isn't about party loyalty. It's about doing what's right for the American people. Sometimes that means making difficult choices." The bill passed, and Leavitt's support remained solid among the moderates and independents. The conservatives, however, were unforgiving. Her reputation among her core base had taken a hit, and many wondered whether she could recover. But Leavitt didn't care about the backlash. In her mind, she had done what she believed was right. She had taken the necessary steps to move past the press conference incident and prove that she could be a leader who put policy over politics. Whether or not that decision would cost her re-election remained to be seen. The media, as always, had moved on to the next story, but the echoes of her actions would continue to reverberate. Leavitt had made a choice, one that would define her career, for better or for worse. The fallout from Karoline Leavitt's bold decision to vote in favor of the healthcare reform bill was far from over. As the dust began to settle, she was forced to confront a reality she hadn't fully anticipated: her political identity had shifted in ways she couldn't control. Her conservative base, once her strongest supporters, felt betrayed. Conservative talk shows and social media platforms were ablaze with criticism. Commentators accused her of abandoning her principles and cozying up to the political establishment. Some even speculated that Leavitt was positioning herself for a future as a moderate Republican, or even a Democrat. But despite the backlash, Leavitt's polling numbers among independent voters and moderates had improved. Many saw her decision to back the bill as an act of leadership, a politician willing to make tough choices for the good of the nation, even if it meant alienating some of her most vocal supporters. The question now was whether this shift in support was temporary or whether it could provide a pathway to a new kind of political career. In the halls of Congress, the conversations about her were becoming more complicated. Some members of her own party privately expressed admiration for her willingness to stand by her convictions, while others feared that she was going rogue. Some argued that her moderation could be the key to future success in a country growing increasingly divided, while others saw it as a dangerous move that could fracture the Republican Party. Leavitt's leadership team, already fractured by her decision to remove Jennifer Hayes from the press conference, found themselves navigating a fine line. They had spent months carefully crafting her image as a bold, unapologetic leader, but now they had to pivot. She was no longer just a right-wing firebrand. She was something more complex, something that didn't fit neatly into any political box. The media continued to play a major role in shaping the narrative. Reports from both conservative and liberal outlets analyzed her every move, scrutinizing her speeches, interviews, and votes. Some hailed her as a potential future leader of a new, more moderate Republican Party. Others painted her as a political opportunist who had abandoned her roots. Leavitt, however, was determined to stay focused on what she believed was best for the country. She refused to let the noise distract her from her work. But privately, the pressure was mounting. She was beginning to realize that her every decision, no matter how well-intentioned, had the potential to derail her career. She had walked a fine line between being a bold, conservative leader and a pragmatic politician willing to compromise. The public's reaction to her recent decisions was proof that it was an impossible tightrope to walk. At a fundraiser in New Hampshire, her home state, Leavitt tried to rally her supporters, speaking passionately about the need for unity in an increasingly polarized America. She spoke about the importance of healthcare reform and lowering prescription drug costs, but also about the need for fiscal responsibility and ensuring that the government didn't overstep its bounds. The crowd was mixed. Some of the longtime supporters who had stood by her during her early campaigns were enthusiastic, nodding along in agreement. Others, however, seemed uneasy, whispering among themselves about whether the Congresswoman had lost her way. One donor, an influential business leader in New Hampshire, pulled Leavitt aside after the speech. "Karoline," he said, his voice low but urgent, "you've got to decide where you stand. People don't like this middle ground. You're either with us, or you're with them. And right now, I'm not sure which side you're on." Leavitt stood silently for a moment, absorbing his words. She had always prided herself on being a leader who could stand on principle, who wasn't afraid to call things as they were. But now, as the pressure from both sides mounted, she realized just how difficult it would be to maintain that balance. She thanked the donor and left the event with her mind racing. There was a part of her that longed for the simpler days, when she could take bold, decisive actions without worrying about the long-term consequences. But the path ahead wasn't simple anymore. The question wasn't whether Leavitt would continue to push forward with her moderate stance, it was whether she could manage to lead a divided party, a divided nation, without losing herself in the process. The road ahead was uncertain. But Karoline Leavitt was determined to carve out her own path, no matter how difficult it might be. As the political tides continued to shift, Karoline Leavitt found herself at the center of an ideological storm that threatened to reshape her future. The decision to back the healthcare reform bill had opened new doors, but it had also slammed shut several others. Her base, once steadfast in their loyalty, had fractured. Many saw her as a symbol of Republican ideals compromised, while others cheered her for bridging the political divide. But compromise in the polarized landscape of Washington wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a gamble. The Republicans who had once supported her in her rise to prominence now viewed her with suspicion. Whispers in the halls of Congress hinted that some were quietly preparing to distance themselves from her if she continued down this moderate path. Her status within the party was becoming more fragile by the day. Her appearance at the latest GOP fundraiser was proof of how much the tide had turned. It wasn't the welcoming reception she had come to expect in the past. Conversations around the room turned cold as soon as her name was mentioned. The donors were polite but distant. The donors from the conservative wing of the party who had supported her initial rise to Congress avoided eye contact. And the whispers? They were no longer about her rise as a future leader, they were now about her future in the party. Despite the lackluster reception, Leavitt remained composed. She had been in the game long enough to understand that politics was never a straight line, and right now, her course was anything but predictable. Her supporters, those still loyal to her, reassured her that staying the course was the best option. They wanted to see her grow beyond the conservative caricature that had been placed on her. They wanted her to lead, not just shout from the sidelines. But as her appearance on conservative talk shows became more frequent, she couldn't ignore the growing tension. The voices from the left had begun to praise her courageous stance on healthcare reform. The mainstream media, which had once been quick to criticize her, now called her a moderate Republican to watch. But Leavitt knew all too well that the media's love affair with her would be short-lived. They were quick to build you up just as they were to tear you down. It wasn't just the press or the party that was putting pressure on her. The upcoming election cycle loomed large, and she had to face the reality that she needed to secure her seat. Her district, once a safe haven for right-wing politics, was now becoming more competitive. Leavitt could no longer rely on her base to carry her to victory. If she wanted to hold on to her seat, she would need to win over the moderates, and maybe even some Democrats. Her team started strategizing on how to reach these voters. The plan was clear: double down on healthcare reform, while positioning herself as a pragmatic problem solver. She was no longer the fiery, take-no-prisoners figure from her early days in Congress. The new Karoline Leavitt was a political operator, someone who could win with compromise and deal-making. However, just as she began to feel she had a clear path forward, an unexpected challenge emerged. A new challenger from her own party, a more conservative, hardline figure, announced they were running against her in the upcoming primary. The challenger, William Stone, was a former state legislator with deep connections in the conservative movement. He had been gaining traction with voters who felt betrayed by Leavitt's shift in policy. Stone's campaign immediately went on the offensive, accusing Leavitt of abandoning her principles and selling out to the liberal establishment. His message resonated deeply with the base that had once been her most ardent supporters. As Stone's campaign gained momentum, it became clear that Leavitt was in a battle for her political life. The challenge from Stone forced Leavitt to re-evaluate her strategy. The moderates she had been courting weren't going to be enough to secure her re-election. She needed to win back the conservative voters who felt alienated by her recent decisions. But doing so would mean making concessions, walking back some of her moderate stances, and risking the fragile support she had built with the center-left. It was a delicate balancing act, one that required navigating the extremes of both sides without completely alienating either. But Leavitt had never been one to back down from a challenge. She dug in her heels, taking to the campaign trail with renewed vigor, speaking at town halls, meeting with constituents, and making her case for why she was still the right choice for the district. "Look, I'm not going to pretend that we all agree on everything," she told a crowd at one of her town halls. "But what I can promise you is that I will always listen. I will always work to bring solutions to the table, even when that means stepping outside of the comfort zone." Her words were met with a mix of applause and skepticism. It was clear that the district was no longer united behind her. She had to earn back every vote, every inch of ground she had lost. In the coming weeks, the race grew even more intense. The primary between Leavitt and Stone was no longer just about policy, it was about identity. The narrative had shifted from, "who can represent the people best," to, "who is truly loyal to the Republican Party." Leavitt's campaign was a microcosm of the larger struggle within the GOP. It was a battle for the soul of the party, and Karoline Leavitt was in the eye of the storm. The weeks leading up to the primary felt like an eternity for Karoline Leavitt. Every speech, every campaign stop, every debate was under the magnifying glass. The pressure to perform was suffocating, but Leavitt was no stranger to pressure. She had always thrived in the heat of a fight. Still, this battle was unlike any she had fought before. William Stone, her challenger, had solidified his position as the conservative standard-bearer. His rallies were packed with fervor, his supporters chanting for a return to real Republican values. The attacks against Leavitt became sharper, more personal. He labeled her a "rhino," Republican in name only, and accused her of betraying the very principles that had propelled her to Washington. To many in the district, Stone's message was clear: Leavitt was no longer one of them. Leavitt,